I think about liberalism as a way of thinking about how different people and different communities might associate with one another in a world where people not only have different interests and different ends, but also different values. The question is then, how can they associate with one another? And I think liberalism is an idea that says, rather than trying to come to a conclusion about the right way to live one's life, about the right way to choose the correct ends or to form the right communities, what we do instead is think about a way in which we can coexist peacefully. I think that is the main impulse behind liberalism. And the conclusion I think liberals then reach is that the way to establish such an order is by trying to promote the idea of individual freedom. But the individual freedom is embedded in a kind of society in which people, of course, commonly associate with one another, but they associate with one another freely. I think there's a lot of similarity between the way I look at the world and the way that Rawls does, and I've been greatly influenced in my thinking through engaging with Rawls's ideas. And I think particularly his later ideas stress much more the importance of trying to find a set of norms that people can come together in agreement upon, so as to allow their different ways of thinking to coexist. I think where I depart from Rawls's thinking, however, is in rejecting his view that what we need, therefore, is some sort of coalescence around certain principles of justice, certain deeper norms, which we might come to through different routes on the basis of our different ethical convictions. We need, he thinks, to come to some much deeper agreement than I think is necessary. In a way, the way that I see it is to consider society as not really shaped in such a way as to be united around a set of norms. I see it as something that's, in a sense, much less stable than he does. And certainly I'm not troubled by the way in which this instability might continue to exist. Whereas I think what Rawls is really worried about is how can you establish a set of norms or a set of ideals which people can come to agreement upon so that they will be able to stay in a stable political society over the long term. I think that's neither feasible, mostly, nor desirable. I think what you need really is a kind of political order where there is greater change and adaptation and reconfiguration of systems of governance. I think he's worried about that because I think he thinks that this instability ultimately is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. Yes. I think the first thing I would say is that we can't expect to establish some kind of political order on the basis of a previously existing shared conception. The creation of a shared conception really is the outcome of our coexistence. Mm-hmm. So if you like to put it in a set of terms borrowed from the existentialists, I think existence precedes essence. Mm-hmm. We've got to actually cooperate before we come to understand the norms of cooperation. And my sense is that the norms of cooperation that will emerge in our attempting to live, to coexist peacefully, are really norms which don't necessarily share a single theoretical conception of freedom, but which will have at their basis an emphasis on simply peaceful cooperation. Mm-hmm. I think what's troubling is the idea that within this structure of cooperation, there may be some people who think, well, we have a better theory of cooperation which will give us a kind of deeper unity, a deeper shared existence. And what this will amount to really is the imposition, in a way, of one particular conception of what living together might mean. Now, of course, this will happen not necessarily just through force. It may happen through all kinds of other mechanisms. Persuasion might be one, propaganda might be another. But what it will be is the elaboration and enforcement of a particular kind of view of, of social unity. And this is what I'm resistant to, because I don't think it's necessary, but I also think that ultimately it's something that will tend to undermine the idea of a liberal society as one which is mostly concerned about peaceful coexistence among people who are in many ways very different. Well, I'm very much influenced mostly, I think, in this by Hayek and by his idea of society as an extended order of human cooperation. And in this conception, there are no natural boundaries that separate one society from the next. Society is, in a sense, continuous. Of course, there are within this different societies to the extent that one can move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. You can move from place to place, noticing that there are different characteristics, different norms, and so on. But in another sense, of course, this is simply continuous. It's not that there are discrete, closed entities that operate separately from one another. And I think this has really shaped my way of thinking about what a free society is like. It's a society in which these boundaries are permeable and they are reflective of the continuity of cooperation. To this extent, I was very taken by and sympathetic to Nozick's understanding of utopia as something that existed as a result of people pursuing their own understandings of utopia. For him, utopia is not one conception of a perfect place, but is really a place in which many different conceptions of the perfect place could coexist. The interesting thing about Nozick's view, however, is that he recognizes that for someone to live in his or her own utopia, unless he wanted to be completely a hermit, he would have to find other people who are willing to share the same conception. Now, what this means is that it's very, very unlikely that you'll ever find a utopia in which everybody agrees with you, because if everyone wanted, to be dominant within the utopia, they'd all be hermits. So every utopia, ironically, in Nozick's conception, is a compromise, because you'll never find a world in which everybody shares the same view, unless you think about the utopias of, say, Thomas More, where the understanding of a utopia is a perfect place to which everybody must conform, whether they like it or not. So this, I think, is a very interesting aspect of Nozick's thinking. On the other hand, what I find less persuasive about Nozick's view is the idea that for this to exist, you need a framework. Because the question is, what work is the framework doing? It's not a filter device, because all the things that such a device might do would simply exist normally in the course of interactions among different communities in any case. If there was movement between communities, exchange, trade, argument, you could still get that filtering device. Communities that people were not interested in would fade away. Those which were attractive would attract more people. So what's the need for the framework? I think this is something that's curious about Nozick's view, and of course it's one of the things that the anarchists picked up on straight away. Of course, one always invents these histories when one looks back, so it's hard to know whether this is the truth or simply now my reconstruction. But growing up in Malaysia, there were many things that shaped my own thinking. Growing up in a society that was that was very diverse culturally, and growing up as a member of a cultural minority in a society where the majority had certain privileges for interesting historical reasons. I won't go into this now. And I always felt that there was something troubling about this, because it was, on the one hand, a society in which obviously people got along, but on the other hand, also a society where there were significant mutual, antipathies, if not antagonisms. And it's something I was never very happy with. And it was also something my father was always very critical of in particular. So I think this nurtured a lot of naturally liberal sentiments, even though on matters of economics and social policy. As I grew up, I was very much a person of the Labour Party left. When I moved to Australia, this is the set of convictions that I developed. But then reading two things really started to change my mind. One was reading Popper's The Poverty of Historicism in particular, which made me much more critical of Marxism, which I'd become very attracted to. Reading The Open Society, which to some extent also, it didn't turn me into a libertarian, but it made me much more critical of my previous views. Then I think reading Hayek was probably the most important turning point. I think trying to engage with his ideas and criticizing them, which is what I did in my doctoral thesis and in my first book, nonetheless made me very sympathetic to this sort of a view of the world. So I think it was, in the end, it was Hayek who was the most significant influence in my thinking. I subsequently read many other classical liberal and libertarian philosophers, and I've changed my views about lots of things as a result. But I think Hayek was probably the most important figure. In one way, I'd say there isn't a single book or two books to read, because what I think is strongest in a way in the libertarian tradition is not so much the philosophy as the combination of history and social theory. Some of it is rooted in economics, but not all of it is that. Is really in a way much more interesting. I think libertarian writers have done a lot to try to examine the modern state and its evolution, and try to understand how this has developed. But that said, if you were looking for some things to start, just going on my own particular history, I think The Road to Serfdom, really, although it's not the first work of Hayek's that I read, is to my mind the shortest and most accessible introduction to certain classical liberal ideals. Then the other thing is also a work by Hayek, which I think is very important, and that's the first volume of Law, Legislation and Liberty, called Rules and Order. And I think this is where he gives his most interesting social theoretical account of what the nature of a free society is as an extended order. It's not as much of a normative theory as you might find in other parts of his work, in the Constitution of Liberty or in the other parts of Law, Legislation and Liberty. But I think this is Hayek's most innovative contribution. Well, I think for me, especially in the last 20 years or so, one of the most important books is one by James Scott, an anthropologist at Yale, called Seeing Like a State. I would generally recommend any of Scott's books, but that in particular, I think, is a very, very powerful critique of state tendencies. It's not going to provide you with a particular normative framework for thinking anything in particular, but I think it will give you a pretty sharp critical perspective on states and on state institutions more generally that will force you to rethink a lot of your assumptions about the way in which political power operates.